Wonderful, thank you everybody. So we have heard quite a lot about the history of SCPO this morning in the first session, but we would like to now talk about talk a little bit more about the present day situation with SCPO and invite, we've got 4 speakers to come and give us some quick fire snapshots of their work. 3 are from our SCPO network, and we also have Gethin, our special guest from Wales. So as you might have heard David say earlier, SCPO today is less of an office and more of a network and a partnership that aims to reflect the essential characteristics of churches in common life. And the idea behind this is that this is a more effective way to relate to decision makers in a collaborative way. So without further ado, I will bring up our first speaker, Anthony Horan. Anthony is the director of the Scottish Catholic Parliamentary Office, and his primary role is to engage with politics on behalf of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Scotland. So Anthony, if you would like to join me on the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honour to be here with you today. On the 12th of May 1999, when the Scottish Parliament was enjoying its first session after the Scottish people voted overwhelmingly for devolution, I was most likely sitting university exams hoping to become a lawyer. Either that or I was in the university bar celebrating exam completion. But whatever I was doing, my mind was not on the Scottish Parliament, nor indeed on politics at all. I did become a lawyer and enjoyed that profession for many years, but it started to become clear that God had other plans. And so on 25th of July 2016, I walked through the door of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Scotland to start a new chapter in my life as director of the Catholic Parliamentary Office. In truth, I had never been an avid follower of politics. My interest could be described as politics light. I was driven more by my interest in the law and increasingly a passion for my faith, which is perhaps why I saw the opportunity to work for the Catholic Bishops' Conference as one too good to miss. And I guessed that I would soon learn all about the wheres and what fors of politics. And I did, at least I think I have. And sad political geek that I now am, I find it absolutely fascinating. But it's also very challenging. There are people who say that religion, Christianity included, should be kept out of politics and public life, that it should be kept private. A 2023 poll of 53 MSPs would suggest that efforts to privatise religion, be they subtle or otherwise, have to some extent been successful. The poll found that while 55% of MSPs belong to a specific religion or faith, only 23% said that religion has a very important role in their life, and just 21% said that their faith influences how they make decisions in the Scottish Parliament. It can be challenging to engage day to day in the world of politics as a person of faith. There are recent examples of politicians who have been on the wrong end of flack for daring to speak openly and honestly about their beliefs and values that they hold dear and that are in keeping with their faith. Publicly mocked and vilified for being honest about what they believe in. And we've witnessed this both in Holyrood and in Westminster. And all of this, I think, adds to the anxiety of Christian politicians being open about their beliefs and suggests that life is just easier if you don't share it. But surely a privatised religion is no use. If we want a truly diverse, tolerant and democratic politics and social life that's open to all people, all perspectives, all viewpoints, and in which honest and robust debate takes place on the most important issues affecting our nation, then there must be a place for faith in it. As Christians, we proclaim the good news. If it truly is good news, then surely Christians, and this includes Christian politicians too, then we should be all desperate to share it. For the common good, if nothing else. And nobody should be cowed or coerced into privatising their beliefs. Another challenge is the decreasing number of people of religion in Scottish society, and we've already heard talk about this earlier on today. You will have seen the recent census results, which, as has already been spoken about, reveals a smidgen over half the population of Scotland consider themselves to be of no religion, and 43% said that they belong to a religious group. Now, of course, there are question marks over the census. For example, what does no religion mean, and what does it mean to belong to a religion? It's open to interpretation, may cause some confusion, but nonetheless, the results are sobering. When we look around us today, lack of hope and despair are not found wanting, especially among our young people. Perhaps there is a link between this and the apparent decline of religion in Scotland and the wider UK. I don't know. But there's a lot of uncertainty and uneasiness in the world. War, conflict, pandemics, poverty, addiction, environmental concerns, inequalities, job worries. These are just a few examples highlighting the challenging world in which we now live. We've witnessed society becoming more fragmented and factional too, dividing itself, and politicians are often caught in the crossfire between competing interests. But in these challenges, does there lie opportunity? I think we need to strive more consciously to find common ground that unites us all, to touch a visceral nerve, as it were, a key ingredient that none of us can do without. And perhaps that key ingredient is our dignity. Human dignity cuts across all aspects of life, including the social and the political. There is no policy or legislation that fails to have an impact on human dignity, and the Scottish Parliament is grappling with these day and daily, including right now. Consider the devastating recent announcement regarding drugs-related deaths. Another year, another unwanted record. And ongoing attempts to tackle poverty, forever and ever ongoing. And also the Parliament's consideration of the Assisted Dying for Terminally Ill Adult Scotland Bill. There may be diversions of opinion on the bill in this room, but what we can surely agree on is that human dignity has to be at the centre of the debate. If there is one thing I hope and pray for as we wave goodbye to 1/4 century of the Scottish Parliament and welcome a new one, it's that over the next 25 years we will work hard to put human dignity at the centre of our social and political discourse. That human dignity, as the thread that runs through all of us without exception, will be the prism through which all future legislation and policy is consciously debated. Not a nod and a wink in its direction, but a genuine effort to explore and understand human dignity and to ensure that it's given the respect it deserves. Now, I've worked with many wonderful people over the last 8 years. Every day I find myself working with Christians from all traditions and backgrounds, and people of other faiths too, and some of no faith. We meet regularly, we share information, ideas, we dialogue, and sometimes we find opportunities for joint working, all working towards the common good. And a lot of that work is facilitated and supported by the Scottish Church's Parliamentary Office, through committed people like David and Robin, and also Chloe Clemens and Irene McKinnon before them. Through Devolution, churches and other faith groups have in many ways been invited to engage more regularly and more locally in dialogue on various aspects of social and political life in Scotland, and I think that's all to the good. And the pandemic, and whilst our first thought must always be for those who lost their lives and those they left behind, it did bring faith communities together in a new way as we grappled with the crisis and supported the establishment of a Scottish Government faith and belief team, which still meets regularly and is a key point of contact between faith communities and the government. And the interconnectedness between faith communities and the government and politicians is arguably better than it's ever been. The infrastructure is there. We just need to make the most of it. Now, David spoke earlier about the mace of the Scottish Parliament, and it's constructed of Scottish silver with an inlaid band of gold panned from Scottish rivers. The gold band is intended to symbolise the marriage of the Parliament, the land and the people, and as David said earlier, the words wisdom, justice, compassion and integrity are woven into thistles at the head of the mace to represent the aspirations of the Scottish people for the members of their Parliament. Now, these are noble principles and serve as an important guide for our nation. And the reason these principles are noble, that they are so important, surely is human dignity. For without it, they would not be necessary. For example, what point justice if there is no human dignity? It would be wonderful if the next 25 years was to bear the hallmark of a quarter century centred, aided by our witness and the witness of those who follow us, on the human person and our dignity as a son or daughter of God. We may be ministers, priests, social carers, volunteers, politicians, activists, lobbyists, lay faithful, whatever. But fundamentally, we are witnesses. Witnesses to our faith. Pope Francis said this to young people on Courageous Witness, and it's relevant to us too. Remain steadfast in the journey of faith with firm hope in the Lord. This is the secret of our journey. He gives us the courage to swim against the tide. Pay attention to go against the current. This is good for the heart, but we need courage to swim against the tide. And Jesus gives us this courage. There are no difficulties, trials, or misunderstandings to fear, provided we remain united to God as branches to the vine, provided we do not lose our friendship with him, and provided we make ever more room for him in our lives. With him, we can do great things. He will give us the joy of being his disciples, his witnesses. It's important that we don't shy away from a Christian witness in the world. We aren't trying to force our beliefs on others. It's not coercion. It's honesty. And it's responsible citizenship. So let's share our joy, our hope, and our love. Let people see what it's like to be a follower of Christ, including our parliamentarians. And let's do so without compromising or privatising aspects of our faith. We are called to convince others, politicians included, to aim for something higher, to give people meaning, something to live for, not just here in the present, but for eternity. And by looking to the ultimate goal in the future, we can do great things here in the present. I've been immensely blessed to have met and worked with many wonderful people from other churches and other faiths in my work as parliamentary officer. It gives me great hope that by continuing to work together, we can make things better going forward, continuing to work tirelessly to respect, protect, and promote the dignity of every human being, putting human dignity front and centre of social and political discourse for the next 25 years and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. We've got time for one quick question after each talk, so I'd like to throw open the floor if anybody has a question for Anthony.
Thank you. Surely one of the burning questions of our time is what's happening in the Middle East. And regardless of your position on Israel-Palestine, what you have are two equal quantities of people who have a right to the land, to live there in dignity and equality. Now, the Palestinian, it's not happening. Now, Palestinian Christians have been shouting loudly as to why is it the Christian churches are not speaking up and talking and explaining to the rest of the world what is happening in order to influence our governments. Yet every week, for the last 11 months, we've had thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of the public marching between London and Aberdeen in protest about what is happening. And yet the churches are silent, virtually. What is it we can do as members of faith groups to encourage our own faith groups to take a position and to speak up for what is essentially a human rights issue, what should happen in the future, and also to encourage the cross-party parliamentary group to be able to raise the issue with the government, whether it's with London or with Holyrood.
Well, I think on that second point, certainly, obviously, you probably would be better speaking to your MPs rather than raising it at Holyrood, because of course it's a reserved matter in terms of foreign affairs. So that would be what I would say about that. In terms of the churches, we've certainly had bishops speaking out about it, particularly Archbishop William Nolan, who is the Archbishop of Glasgow for the Roman Catholic Church. And he's spoken about this and on a number of occasions. And events have been held. In fact, just a few months ago, we had a priest from Gaza who was here and who spoke very movingly and passionately and quite disturbingly about the events in Gaza. And these kind of events are what will raise awareness of the plight of the people of Gaza and in Israel too. And so those are the kind of things that are happening. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily that the churches are not saying anything. I think they are. There's always room for more. I'm sure we can do that. But I do think the churches have been speaking out about this issue, and hopefully they'll continue to do so going forward, because it's an absolute tragedy what's happening there at the moment. And there's a lot of politics in there, especially when you look at what's going on at the moment, and it's also it's a sensitive issue. We've seen some of the violence that erupted in recent months, particularly down south as well. So it has to be dealt with sensitively, but at the same time, the call for peace has to be robust, and we have to continue to do it.
So we'll move on to our next speaker. So we're going to call Sarah Komashko up now. Sarah is employed by Quakers in Britain to engage with the Scottish Parliament and government, as well as a range of other Scottish political and public audiences to enact change.
Thank you, and hello everyone. As has been said, my name is Sarah Komashko, and I've been the Parliament Engagement Officer for Quakers in Britain for about 14 months now. It's a bit of a theme. I also used to be a lawyer and saw this job come up and thought, that sounds interesting. My immediate predecessor in role is also here in the audience, so hopefully he agrees with some of what I am about to say. I've been asked to share with you today a few reflections around Quakers in Scotland's engagement with the Scottish Parliament. So I'm going to briefly discuss some of the history of this engagement and highlight some key events and learnings that we've had over that time. Just to zoom out first, in case there's anyone that's not particularly familiar with Quakers, they're a faith group committed to searching for truth and working for equality and peace, believing that each person can have direct experience of the Spirit of God, and also, similar to that notion of human dignity, that there's something of God expressed in everyone's life. These beliefs underpin Quakers' political engagement, which is rooted in the Quaker testimonies of peace, truth, equality, simplicity, and sustainability. As one example of that global political engagement, Quakers maintain houses in Geneva and New York to work with diplomats in the UN, multilateral organisations and NGOs. They often use a method of quiet diplomacy, which brings together people from different sides in the same room in a neutral space, centring the time on listening deeply, speaking truthfully and finding a common way forward. Quakers in Britain similarly have a team of staff down south to engage with representatives in Westminster and support Quakers within Britain to do the same at a local level. Quakers in Scotland have their own very specific part to play, and they've been engaging with Holyrood parliamentarians ever since the Scottish Parliament was set up. Initially, I think primarily through the SCPO, which we've continued to be involved with since. In 2011, however, there began to be a feeling that there might be a place for a distinctively Quaker voice to work in complement with the SCPO. Particularly, the Quakers in Scotland sent in some consultation responses in relation to same-sex marriage and other issues that were of interest to the Quaker community in Scotland. In 2012, a parliamentary liaison function group was set up, which was composed of volunteers who sought to do advocacy on issues such as Trident, marriage equality and criminal justice. The focus of the group was both to do the advocacy themselves and build relationships with MSPs, but also to provide materials which could be used at a local level by local meetings and individual Quakers. The group of volunteers thought that they could increase effectiveness by having a staff member, and since 2015 there has been the part-time role of Parliamentary Engagement Officer working with the group, which is now known as the Parliament Engagement Working Group. My PEO role is supported by the wider resources of Quakers in Britain and connected into the work that my colleagues do at a UK level. The work of the Parliament Engagement Group and the Parliamentary Engagement Officer focuses on that Quaker belief of there being that of God in everyone, with everyone having an individual voice which should be heard. Priorities of the group are discerned by the Scotland-wide body of General Meeting for Scotland and have ebbed and flowed over the years depending on the opportunities there have been for influencing and sharing Quaker perspectives. So now moving on, let me share some examples of how this work has manifested over the years. An early concern was militarisation in society. This work began with a single Quaker, David Turner's concern, and grew into a significant project. For 2 years, we sent all MSPs white peace poppies, together with some information about the White Poppy Initiative. Some of these were then worn in Parliament. This initiative evolved into a partnership with an organisation called Forces Watch to oppose the military presence in Scottish schools. A petition was lodged by former Parliamentary Engagement Officer Mary Campbell-Jack. This gained over 1,000 signatures, and Quakers in Scotland were asked to come in and provide evidence to the Petitions Committee about the topic. This led to the committee publishing a report recommending that a children's rights impact assessment be done on military visits to schools, and also recommending that careers information provided to young people should reflect the challenges and risks involved in an armed forces career so that they're fully informed. This notion of partnering with other groups is a theme and we believe a strength of our approach. Over the years, as relevant to the work we're engaging with at the time, we've also partnered with Edinburgh Peace and Justice Centre and Campaign Against the Arms Trade on peace issues, Together Scotland in relation to issues relevant to children's rights specifically, and Christian Aid and Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, also known as SCCS, in relation to our climate justice priority. This allows us to show a broader range of support for our aims and to bring our Quaker influence into that joint work. For example, soon after I started, I attended a meeting with SCCS and the Scottish Government in relation to carbon capture and negative emissions technologies. At first, the relevance of the Quakers to the meeting wasn't clear, that's a lot of technology specialists, a lot of scientific expertise that I don't have. But actually, SCCS found that our voice was very useful. Our presence gave a voice for truth and honesty when it came to the feasibility of some of these unproven technologies. Another example of our work with others was the Whangare's Trees performance and peace education exhibition, which we held last September, together with Scottish Mediation, who carry out peer mediation in schools. This built on meetings with MSPs to discuss Peace at the Heart, a report produced by the peace education team within Quakers in Britain in 2003. Whangare's Trees was a performance by primary 5 pupils from Glasgow, some of whom hadn't even been to Edinburgh before, never mind the Parliament. It was an example of their classroom use of peace education to consider questions of global impact and empathy, as well as creativity in coming up with songs and dramas to tell the story of Whangari. The performance and subsequent exhibition were well attended by MSPs, and we received many signatures for our motion calling for more consistent funding of peace education within schools. One final case study of our engagement that I wanted to share was of an opportunity for an event that came on the back of a time for reflection given to the Scottish Parliament by Quaker attender Leslie Morrison in April 2023. Leslie spoke on the theme of "Are we being good ancestors?" This was really well received by MSPs and led to Christine Graham MSP sponsoring an event just in March on the subject of health and climate, looking at the win-win solutions which could both improve our national health and also benefit the planet. Given the ongoing political concern around health and its associated budgetary cost, this was really effective in terms of highlighting our concern around climate change. At the event, Quakers and friends, including a young person, spoke to several MSPs, including Marie Todd, who's the Minister for Social Care, Mental Wellbeing and Sport. Several more MSPs participated in individual discussions with us after the meeting about issues that we'd highlighted. After Leslie's positive experience, we've helped other Quakers submit pieces for time for reflection, though with the assurance that not every single time for reflection need lead to a parliamentary event. Reflecting on these experiences, I wanted to finish up just by briefly sharing some of the lessons we've learned about effective engagement. First, collaboration is important. Working with other organisations amplifies our voice, allows us to share expertise, and brings that Quaker perspective to wider discussions. Collaboration within our own community has been important too, drawing on knowledge and long-standing commitment amongst different groups of Scottish friends has been vital for the group, while also, we hope, strengthening a sense of unity and shared purpose for Quakers in Scotland. Secondly, local connections are really helpful for MSP engagement. We found that when local Quakers reach out to their MSPs, particularly if those individual Quakers have been actively trying to build a relationship and continue correspondence with them, then it significantly increases interest in our events and messages and opens doors which might otherwise be closed. Finally, continuity and follow-up are crucial. One piece of work, such as on militarism in schools, can link to or support others like peace education and raising questions about military carbon emissions. At the Health and Climate event, we produced an information pack and used that as a request for follow-up discussions with those that had expressed interest in the event. And that led to individual meetings extending our impact just beyond those MSPs that had time and were available to attend the event itself. So in closing, as we look to the future, we see continued opportunities for speaking the truth on climate emergency mitigation and calling for climate justice, exploring themes of integrity in public life, and promoting peace education and peace more generally. I'd say while politics can often seem gloomy, Quakers find hope in personal connections with MSPs. Quakers seek to live faithfully and influence those around us, including politicians, bit by bit. As the Scottish Parliament moves into its next 25 years, we'll continue our engagement, guided by the Quaker belief of that of God in everyone and our vision of a peaceful and sustainable future built on just relationships.
If we'd like to call our next speaker, Major David Cavanagh. David is an officer in the Salvation Army and is appointed as the Assistant Secretary for Scotland. He is responsible for the day-to-day political engagement and national ecumenical affairs in Scotland.
Well, good afternoon to you all. I'm very grateful to David and the organisers of this conference for giving me the opportunity to speak this afternoon, and I'm very grateful to all of you for staying to listen towards the end of what is quite a long day. I've been an officer of the Salvation Army for 32 years, the last 4, as Robin just said, serving in what we call the Scotland Office, which essentially takes care of our engagement with political institutions in Scotland, mainly the Parliament and government because of a question of capacity. More about that later. And on the other hand, our ecumenical and interfaith relationships in Scotland at a national level. So again, the conversations in those arenas are typically about what the churches and faith movements want to do and say in the public arena. So those two elements of the role fit together quite neatly. Now, the Scotland office was actually established some years before devolution. Back in 1990, there was another union when what was until then the Scotland territory of the Salvation Army became absorbed into what is now the UK and Ireland territory. It was recognised, however, that Scotland is, in many respects, another country. Because of its history, there are significant differences in the legal system, in education, more generally, also in a culture that's deeply been shaped, as we've heard several times this morning, by the historic influence of the Kirk and its close involvement in Scottish life ever since the 1707 Act of Union and the dissolution of the Scottish Parliament at that time. And as we've heard, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in some ways was considered almost the closest thing that Scotland had to a parliament. It's also significant that the Church of Scotland is the heir of John Knox, rather than, as is the case south of the border, where there is an established church, Thomas Cranmer or Hugh Latimer, and there's therefore been a very different feel to Scotland. Now, the advent of devolution, I think, has strengthened the distinctive character of Scotland over the past 25 years. The Scottish Parliament was granted wide-ranging powers, in many ways, I think, rather more wide-ranging than has been the case in either Wales or in Northern Ireland. And the Scottish Parliament has made significant use of those powers, introducing a series of legislative measures that mean that in many ways Scottish society has diverged from that south of the border. As a parliamentary officer for the Salvation Army in Scotland, my task, as I understand it, is to speak in the public arena, preferably together with other Christian churches, and to a lesser extent, other faith movements, to show the relevance of the Christian faith to public life, and to share the vision of a society in which truth, integrity, justice, compassion, and mercy reign. The Salvation Army is not a national or established church in the way that the Church of England or the Church of Scotland are, but I would say that we are probably a public church. You'll know that the Salvation Army was birthed in the poverty-stricken slums of Victorian England. And from very early on, William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army, together with his wife Catherine, began to say that he had a theology or a gospel for two worlds, by which he meant the present material world that we live in, as well as the future world of eternity in the kingdom of God. So the Salvation Army has been known for it from its beginnings for its involvement in civil society and in social ministry. Every so often I stand on Princes Street, not far from here, to sell the Salvation Army's war cry, and the number of people who will stop me and tell me about their grandparents saying never passed the Salvation Army because of the service and support it gave to the armed services in the war, or because we helped a relative or a friend who was struggling with something like homelessness or with alcohol or substance addiction. So we're known as exponents of a practical Christianity with a deep and broad engagement in civil society. Much broader, perhaps, than people might sometimes imagine. It should also be noted that the Salvation Army in the UK has recently adapted the so-called marks of mission, which means that issues of reconciliation and social justice, together with care for creation, are added to our traditional evangelical and Wesleyan hallmarks of saving souls, growing saints, and serving suffering humanity. And the extent of our involvement in civil society, I think, is illustrated by the campaigns and consultations that we've run over recent years. In the last 4 years, you probably wouldn't be surprised to find that the Salvation Army has produced 2 major reports on homelessness in Scotland. Or perhaps you might, because you might just think the Salvation Army is good people, warm-hearted, who just roll up their sleeves and get on with frontline stuff. We do actually have significant expertise arising from our involvement in many social issues. You might not be surprised to find that I've spent time over recent weeks coordinating and planning for our responses to the latest drug-related death figures, and that we will be responding to both the alcohol-specific death figures, which are due next week, and the housing and homelessness figures, which are due later in September. You might be a little bit more surprised to hear that since 2020, the Salvation Army in Scotland has responded to consultations on proposed legislation on safety for sex workers, 2020, assisted dying, the social care system, both at the consultation stage and more recently again during the committee stage of the proposed bill, protect duty, the circular economy, domestic violence, minimum alcohol unit pricing, heat in buildings, PVG fees, and palliative care. And in addition to that, we've also, together with other faith movements, campaigned for asylum seekers to be granted free public transport, the pilot project which sadly is no more. We've supported the call for the government to guarantee minimum levels of pay for workers in the social care sector, and we have engaged and are engaging substantially with the proposed Right to Recovery Bill. So that's a picture of the breadth of our engagement. I find that the opportunities and challenges of political engagement are often really the 2 sides of the same coin. To mention briefly 3. First of all, capacity. The Scotland office is a very small team. It's myself, my boss, who is a retired officer on 21 hours a week, and an employee who is our secretarial support. And that usually means that we have to work in partnership with other teams to get anything done. When we're developing a response to a consultation, for instance, we have to look around, ask who has the expertise, ask them to produce some draft materials for us, and because they're usually very busy people with lots of frontline responsibility and involvement, that is not easy. And if it's more than one team, it's also coordinating and harmonizing the various materials that we get so that we collate, redraft, and we have to present everything for final approval before publication. As you can imagine, that requires a high degree of coordination. That is often a challenge. But at the same time, and this is the good thing about this means that we're working across all sorts of departmental boundaries, breaking down all sorts of operational silos. And that furthers a framework and a mindset of integrated mission. Secondly, in a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-faith society such as modern Scotland, it's a challenge to find a framework and an idiom that will effectively communicate the relevance of the Christian faith and its contribution to the common good. Now, Rowan Williams has described this as faith experimenting with the rhetoric of its uncommitted environment, and he suggests that it's a witness to the gospel's capacity for being at home in more than one cultural environment, providing the opportunity that this experiment, and here again I'm quoting Williams, may uncover aspects of a deposit of belief hitherto unexamined, and so offer new insights which broaden and deepen our understanding of the gospel. The danger, by contrast, is that an uncritical adoption of contemporary frameworks and patterns may instead dilute our grasp on the gospel and weaken its impact and relevance to reflection on what actually constitutes the welfare of the city, to use Jeremiah's phrase. And finally, there's the search for a common understanding amongst the churches. We've heard today on several occasions about the need or the wish for a Christian voice in the public arena. I have to say that I think that is maybe, at least today, a chimera. There is not a Christian voice. There is a plurality of Christian voices. Because while the Christian churches agree on broad principles, it seems to be more and more the case that we have different views on how these actually play out, how they apply to the social and cultural issues that we're facing. For instance, we all agree that human beings, created in the image and likeness of God, are therefore endowed with an inalienable worth and dignity that should be respected and protected. But we differ, for instance, on how that principle applies to the question of assisted death. Some of us would say that assisted death is itself a violation of that principle. Others would say that instead dignity calls for the ability to make that choice of when your life will end so as to avoid the humiliation of suffering. The danger here is that because there is not one voice, but a plurality of voices, the voice of the Christian churches no longer gives a clear call. If the trumpet does not sound a clarion call, well, I'm not sure that the rank and file always paid that much attention to what the institutional clarion call actually said in the first place. But the opportunity is that because we recognize one another as brothers and sisters in Christ who share a common identity and are bound together at a far deeper level than our differing views might suggest, we can model good disagreement. It's been suggested that SCPO might be a place where churches together developed a common voice. Other voices recently have expressed the view that maybe the Scottish Church Leaders Forum might become that place. I don't think that's the case. I think the Scottish Church's Parliamentary Office is a place where our churches meet so that we understand our differing perspectives, and we then individually speak to the Scottish Parliament and government. But because we have spoken together and we understand one another better, we are able to do so acknowledging that brothers and sisters in Christ have differing perspectives, but we do so in a way that models good disagreement. And I think that in many ways, in a society where debate has become polarized and where politics in Scotland, as we've heard on several occasions today, has lapsed increasingly into tribalism, that may actually be one of the most useful contributions that we can make as Christian churches in Scotland to the political world and to political discussion of our common life together. So, thank you.
Our last speaker, by no means least, is Reverend Gethin Rhys. Gethin is Policy Officer with Cytûn, Churches Together in Wales. He's an ordained minister in the United Reformed Church, and we are delighted to invite him to share his perspective with us from his work in Wales and the Welsh context.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to come. It's been an absolutely fascinating conference. I've been listening with great interest to all the similarities and differences between Wales and Scotland. 24 years ago, I was at a session run in Wales by Aled Edwards and Graham Blount, where they did that exercise for the first year. Of course, we're multiplying it by 25 now, and you'll be glad to hear that I'm not going to reflect on 25 years of similarities and differences at any length. I'm going to simply refer to one similarity, one difference, and one elephant. The similarity is one which David has already just this moment touched on, which is, it seems to me, that effective Christian engagement with our respective parliaments begins from there being active Christians who are doing things. If you run a food bank, it's not long before you ask why people are hungry. If you're opening your church as a warm hub, it's not long before you ask why people are cold. In Wales, if you're hosting a refugee, it's not long before you campaign for your government to declare the nation should be a nation of sanctuary, which is now official Welsh Government policy, 10 years after the churches first started asking for it. In those spheres, we have credibility. We have credibility because we're doing things. And as Mona reminded us earlier, Christians have influence above all when we are not self-serving. The second thing is a difference, at least it's a historical difference, although I'm thinking we may have ended up in a very similar place over the 25 years. 25 years ago, there was no single dominant church in Wales or religious grouping. There is no equivalent in Wales to the throne behind me, and has not been since the Church of England in Wales was disestablished in 1920. And actually, even then, it was not numerically dominant. So it was an easy decision for the Welsh Assembly, as it was then, the Senedd, to decide at the beginning no prayers. There didn't have to be a vote or a controversial debate. It was pretty well obvious. There would be no prayers, although an exception was made from the very first year for Christmas carols and a Christmas carol service, although it was always called a Christmas carol concert to get round the self-imposed restriction. That has been ameliorated, actually. The use of the building is now allowed for religious purposes. The Muslim community was the first, but there have been many Christian events held there now in the Senedd building, as there are other civic events. And there is now a chaplaincy service in the Senedd, something which the Senedd stood against. Actually, the first presiding officer, a faithful Anglican, stood very strongly against the idea of chaplaincy, perhaps assuming that it would be only Christian. There is now a Christian, a Muslim, and a humanist chaplain in the Senedd. It's taken 24 of the 25 years to get to that point, but it is a very good thing that that is the case. In practice, some of my predecessors ended up acting as chaplains, but they weren't officially, and there were all kinds of professional difficulties around being both a policy advocate and a chaplain to the same people. I'm very, very glad that we've moved beyond that. Not to criticise my predecessors, they found themselves in that position, but I'm glad we're not in it anymore. But in the year 2000, the then Welsh Government did set up a forum for churches to come together with the government to share matters of concern. And after 9/11, that became a faith communities forum to bring together all the faith communities of Wales. That's been a very effective instrument since 2001 until last year, when, unfortunately, the Welsh Government lawyers decreed that non-religious groups must be allowed to become part of the forum on equalities grounds. That was opposed by every single religious group, and the forum has not met since. We are working very hard to try and get it re-established as a faith communities forum. Welsh Government quite happily runs an LGBTQ forum. It doesn't invite straight representatives to that. There are very obvious reasons why not. It runs a women's forum. It doesn't invite men to that. There are very obvious reasons why not. We're not clear why a faith communities forum has to have non-faith people in it on equalities grounds. That is an ongoing debate. I'm meeting again with officials next week. Also out of 9/11 grew the Interfaith Council for Wales, the equivalent of Interfaith Scotland, which operates, however, unlike Interfaith Scotland, with no government funding, indeed with no staff, as an entirely voluntary body. It was intertwined with Cytûn for some years, but is now entirely separate, and that is much more healthy, and indeed it has developed a whole new lease of life as a result. So the history of faith engagement is different and in some ways more straightforward and, by the sound of it, somewhat less controversial. We also didn't have to deal with the Section 2A thing, which clearly looked very large in the early years of the Scottish Parliament. It wasn't devolved to Wales at that point, so it was repealed in Westminster without us needing to bother our heads about it. But I think we may have ended up in a similar position. The census suggests that we have ended up, actually, in very similar positions, statistically, at least, with a majority of the populations in both Wales and Scotland saying that they are people of no religion now. Although, and that is very obvious in the lack of religious literacy amongst civil servants, to whom we have to regularly explain very, very, very basic things about church and faith organisation. Although, as in Scotland, religious people are heavily overrepresented amongst members of the Senedd, as they are amongst MSPs. That won't surprise us because of the first point I made. Christians are people who get involved in politics because they do things, and that's why they get involved to the point of standing for elected office. But that lack of religious literacy also, I suspect, leads to a fear, and in Wales at least, to a desire to regulate things that churches do. I'm going through, in 10 years in the job, I think it's the fourth iteration of a desire to regulate Sunday schools and religious instruction, and a third iteration of a desire to register everyone who volunteers in any kind of youth setting. And religious groups are the target for both of those, partly because of fear and partly because, let's be honest, many religious groups have a very poor record in the past on safeguarding, and therefore we're not on the strongest possible ground in arguing back on those grounds. I do wonder whether that's partly what lay behind Shona's remark about people feeling that in Scotland too, that they're discriminated on grounds of faith. I don't think I'd say it in Wales we're discriminated on grounds of faith, but we are sometimes seen as a target for regulation because we are faith groups. And the third thing is the elephant in the room, which I've become rather conscious of during the day. It's been nodded to occasionally, so other people have noticed that the elephant is here, but only nodded in passing. And that is the climate and nature crises. In Wales, we have the Future Generations Act, which requires, or at least it's supposed to require, all public bodies to think when they're making policy about the interests of future generations, people not yet born. It's often interpreted to mean children, but it doesn't mean that. It means people not yet born. Some of us were talking over lunch about thinking ahead to the 7th generation, but actually just thinking ahead 25 years. From the perspective of the generation that will be 25 years old when this conference next convenes, much of today's discussion, if I may dare to say so, has been fiddling around the edges. To fail to tackle the climate and nature crises, one outcome of which may well be that in 25 years' time the Welsh Senedd will be underwater physically, is surely for us. It's not just suicidal folly, that's true for all human beings now. It is for us blasphemy, because we believe that this is God's creation, which we are despoiling. So what will the next conference in 25 years conclude? How much of this was a waste of time because we didn't see the elephant in the room? Thank you.
Thank you, Gethin. Any questions for Gethin? Sarah? Go ahead. Oh, is there a microphone? Yeah.
Thanks, Gethin. I just had a quick question. Sorry, I feel a bit cheeky because no one asked me a question and I'm now asking you one. But I was just interested in what you were saying about the development of the chaplaincy service, because that's something that's come up a couple of times when I've talked to MSPs about the lack of a chaplaincy in the Scottish Parliament, and I just wondered if you could say a few words about how that came about in a Welsh context.
Yeah, I mean, there are two sort of answers to that. The first is that particularly Aled Edwards, as the first officer, informally acted as a chaplain. The first year of the Welsh Assembly, those of you who followed politics in great detail may remember, was an immensely chaotic year, and the whole thing could have failed. The referendum had passed by only 6,000 votes in Wales, very different political situation, not the settled will of the Welsh people then, most definitely. And his role behind the scenes, which I hope he's recorded somewhere. I understand why he's not published anything about it, because it was a pastoral role. But I hope he's recorded it so that when it would be decent, it could be made known. It was really, really important pastorally. So from that first year, there was a realization things can just go wrong. I mean, in terms of the institution now, it can go wrong, and you need somebody to talk to. But that didn't lead straight away to a chaplaincy service, well, because, well, Aled was there, wasn't he? And then his successors were there, so why do we need a chaplain? We've already got one. And what really then brought things to a head, I think, was the absolutely tragic suicide of a Welsh Government minister, Carl Sargent, the author of the Future Generations Act, actually, that I referred to a moment ago, or at least the minister who steered it through the Senedd. And those circumstances made people realise that there was a need for chaplaincy. Now, that was stepped into by Aled again, still, though he'd moved on from the role, but because he was known, and also by one or two other local clergy. But there was a need for chaplaincy for beyond the Christian community and those who felt comfortable going to a cleric. So there was a very particular circumstance. It's then taken several years for the Senedd institution to unwind itself from its original commitment to a secularism that meant no religion, to move to a position of secularism that means all religions and non-religion are treated equally, which is what the word secular actually means. And it's taken quite a while to make that shift in understanding of both the word and the concept. But we got there last year, or they got there. And perhaps that's the important thing. I said we got there, we as a nation. They got there. Gethin and my job had no role in helping them get there. I'm a public affairs officer. I'm not a chaplain. And that distinction has now become clear, I hope. So it's helped from 2 points of view. I hope it's helping members of the Senedd, because they do now have chaplaincy, whatever their belief. But also, I hope it's made my role clearer too.
Thank you, Gethin, and thank you to all of our speakers. I think everyone can appreciate that we have some people who've just spoken, also other people in the room who are absolutely wonderful at what they do, representing their faith groups and to speaking to MPs and MSPs about their work. And I would just like to say on behalf of SCPO, if anybody is wanting to speak more about how they could speak to their MPs or their MSPs, as you've just heard, we've got some people in the room today that could speak to you more about that, or you could speak to David or to Graham, and also our colleagues at Christian Aid also do have some expertise in that area. So just, if that's something of interest to you, please do speak to each other at the reception afterwards, and just thank you again to all of our speakers.